Is there anything sort of transformative in the market that you think you will have to do between now and 5 years in order to remain a leader in the oncology network nationally?
I would go in terms of unaddressed needs beyond just like the health plans and risk bearing groups that we already work with would be kind of the employer and self-insured space. We already have a few existing partnerships across our markets on behalf of employer group populations, but there's just tremendous untapped need there. And I think our model is perfectly suited to deliver great care to those populations. The other big one is MSO enablement. We engage with networks of independent physicians on sort of value-based decision-making and leveraging our ability to deliver care at scale. Oncology care is perfectly set up, though, to engage with them on ancillary service opportunities that brings value both to TOI and those practices.
Welcome to the next episode of the Scale Community Technology and Innovation Podcast. I'm joined by CEO of the Oncology Institute, Daniel Virnich. And Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Jason.
So maybe for those that aren't familiar with the Oncology Institute, if you could start with a brief overview. The business focuses on cancer care and was founded, I believe, back in 2007, but just a quick overview of where the Oncology Institute is today.
Yeah, absolutely. As you just called out, the Oncology Institute, we're not a new organization. We're in our 18th year of business. We've been a public company now for almost 4 years, though. And really, we're the largest value-based oncology platform in the U.S. that operates as a physician group and MSO. We currently have over 80 sites of care across 5 states, primarily medical oncology, but also radiation oncology centers as well. And we have a very simple mission, which is to elevate the level of community-based oncology care and bring value for underserved populations and payers. So that means providing highly consistent, guideline-based care and really trying to bring higher quality, higher level services into the community to shift out of higher cost centers.
And which states are the 5 that you're in?
Yeah, we're in California, Florida, Nevada, Arizona, and Oregon.
Great. So why don't we jump right into what's special about what the Oncology Institute has built? And so I am interested in studying the topic of as provider organizations, MSOs scale, how they use that scale, that footprint to create differentiated services in the market, better care, lower cost of care. And so I'm interested to get a glimpse under the hood at the Oncology Institute. But a bit of context, oncology, I think, has been referenced as about a $200 billion annual spend in the market. I'm reminded of, we did some work with a neurosurgical practice and they were out of network. And I remember speaking to someone in the market and I said, well, how is it that this neurosurgical portion of the market out of network reimbursement has prevailed? And they said, well, when you're going to operate on someone's brain, you don't mess with the people that do that. And I think cancer care has some similarities to that. When you're diagnosed with cancer, you want to get the best care. Of course, cost is always a consideration, but you want to make sure that you're getting the right care. And so the idea of value-based care within oncology, within cancer care, has always been a bit confusing to me. And I'm looking forward to shedding some light on what that means in this market. And again, back to that overarching question of how an organization like the Oncology Institute has created differentiated service and care within the market as you've scaled your organization.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think oncology is one of those beautiful examples in value-based care where there's such a misalignment of reimbursement in kind of the fee-for-service world of the specialty that simply by doing what's right for a patient, you can deliver tremendous value, both for the patient and the payer. The reason I say the patient is there's really good data nationally. You can see it on cancer.gov and other sources that underserved populations, seniors, et cetera, have a tremendously difficult time with just access to care when it comes to cancer care in the US, simply because the out-of-pocket component can be so expensive because the drugs are so expensive. So the real issue in oncology is that the vast majority of the revenue, if you're a fee-for-service practice, comes from the drugs. So unlike, a surgeon who gets primarily reimbursed from their professional services in the procedure, an oncologist, the professional services component makes up a very small percentage, and the drugs are the vast majority of revenue. And the way that those drugs are reimbursed in the fee-for-service world is primarily a cost-plus methodology. So most practices are making, roughly a 6% spread on the drugs after they buy the drug, give it to the patient, and then bill for those services. The real issue with that, of course, is that if you're running a fee-for-service P&L, you're going to get maximum impact by using the most expensive drugs and using them as much as possible because you want to maximize that 6% contribution. And what that results in is a problem where you see the average community-based practice in the US only 70% adherent to the NCCN guidelines, which are kind of the gold standard for care for cancer patients in the US. Tremendous overuse of medications, using medications off label, keeping patients on chemotherapy way longer than they're getting benefit and generating a ton of side effects and hospitalizations as a result of that. Overuse of supportive medications. So really simply aligning to, again, the NCCN guidelines, avoiding, frankly, just doing bad medical decision making for a patient. You can automatically lower utilization a tremendous amount. And then you've got the site of care issue in oncology, which, and again, there's great published data on this already, that shows that when patients are given that care in the community, a tremendous reduction in the amount that's spent per patient, even using similar regimens versus hospital-based infusion centers or tertiary quaternary centers, which are kind of leveraging their influence to generate much higher rates of reimbursement on a unit basis.
I think I remember reading that in addition to the high unit cost of drugs, that the growth rate of the cost of drugs is also quite high, double digits. And so that puts sort of a double whammy of being high unit cost and on the wrong side of inflationary versus deflationary movements and trends in the market. Is that right? That in addition to being a high unit cost, it's also growing rapidly annually?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at the CAGR of like drug costs going back 20 years, I mean, it's always been high single digits, low double digits on a percentage basis year over year. And that's a function of one, the tremendous pipeline of new drugs coming out for cancer care, which is a great thing. I mean, we all want innovation in therapeutics, and we want to make, all cancers more of a chronic disease instead of a terminal diagnosis. But then also year over year, the drug supply chain, manufacturers, distributors kind of leveraging the ability to generate increased unit cost just based on demand.
I always like to ask this question. What does the service stack look like? So in orthopedics, you might have a network of ASCs, you might have partnerships with hospitals, remote patient monitoring. What does that sort of integrated care stack look like within oncology?
Yeah. So we are a clinic-based model. Most medical oncologists are clinic-based, whether they're affiliated, with a hospital or standalone community practice like ours. The primary mode of therapy is either injectable or oral medication. So patients will come to a clinic both for their consultation with a physician, as well as all clinics have an infusion center if the patient needs an injectable medication protocol. That means you're employing nurses, you're mixing the chemotherapy and controlling inventory in the clinic or in a central mixing hub. And then patients qualify for an oral medication, under Part D for their cancer, or a supportive Part D medication that can be given either through an outside specialty pharmacy, or larger practices like ours have their own integrated pharmacy or medically integrated dispensary. And so that's kind of the medical oncology side of the house. The radiation oncology component of care, which about 40% of patients will need both medical and radiation therapy for a cancer type. That's a little bit more complex in terms of care delivery. Care there is delivered in a linear accelerator, which requires a vault since you're delivering radiation, and a number of other sort of technology components like CT scanners to do simulation and modeling. So those centers are much more intensive from a kind of like CapEx equipment perspective. And then the ratio of medical oncology to radiation oncology centers, again, follows that kind of utilization need, which is, a smaller percentage of your patients are going to need the radiation component versus the kind of medical therapy.
What are the other wraparound services, if any, that you're focused on? So do you have home care? Do you have remote patient monitoring, telehealth? Other kinds of wraparound services that allow you to deliver that care. And maybe related to that, we'll come back to reimbursement in a second, but and you've touched on this a little bit in terms of managing down the cost. What allows you to manage down the cost of care for your patients on the medical side as well as on the radiation side, drugs and non-drugs?
Yeah. Absolutely. So, some other services that kind of wrap around that. Telemedicine is a big one. A lot of the patients we take care of are frail. They might be immunocompromised either from their underlying diagnosis or the therapy that they're receiving. So, not ideal for them to come into a healthcare setting where they might be exposed to, infectious risks. So, we do a lot of telemedicine for our kind of face-to-face encounters with our physicians or APPs. Home care, palliative care, and hospice is a big part of oncology. Again, there's a lot of good published data supporting having early involvement in palliative care is actually improving outcomes for cancer patients. So we partner and provide services ourselves related to those functions. Another big one is transfusion services. So again, a lot of cancer patients or patients with a hematologic diagnosis will be anemic or have a low platelet count and benefit greatly from a practice that can provide transfusion support in the clinic setting versus having to obviously go to an emergency room and sit there for a pack of blood cells or get admitted to the hospital. So that's a big part of our model as well. Those are really the big ones for us. In terms of sort of the second part of that question, which is how we control cost of care. Again, there's a couple different buckets to think about. One is site of care shift. So again, there is just on a unit reimbursement basis, a tremendous difference between a community-based practice like the Oncology Institute versus a hospital-based or hospital-affiliated center or an academic center. So again, that even though you're providing identical therapy, you're automatically getting a tremendous arbitrage in terms of being able to lower costs by shifting into the community. And then two, there is just guideline adherence. Again, the unfortunate dark secret of kind of fee-for-service oncology, and I say this as a physician myself who's been practicing for 20 plus years, is that you see a lot of overutilization and off-pathway utilization of drugs. Oftentimes the patients aren't even aware that it's happening, and that's all to generate maximum drug revenue. And again, is not kind of guideline-based or helpful for patients or the greater ecosystem.
When it comes to managing drug spend, how much of that is innovation, clinical research, new types of drugs versus just making sure that you're using the right drug, but the lowest cost available option?
Yeah, it's both really. I mean, it really, again, value-based oncology from our perspective anyways, has nothing to do with like avoidance of the newest drug. In fact, we embrace and encourage our oncologists to incorporate those and we update our pathways, which are shared in our clinics across the country, since we have a shared EHR and kind of system to use newer therapies, since generally the trend has been towards, therapies that can be delivered orally, be delivered via biosimilar, can be delivered more effectively with less regimens. So those are all kind of value-based strategies anyways. And so that's a big part of it. And again, it's the sort of other issue in oncology is just for any given cancer type that the NCCN guidelines are fairly broad, meaning that the number of therapies that are kind of recommended, so to speak, can be 10, 12, sometimes 15. And the range of cost amongst those therapies is sometimes exponentially different between the lowest and highest cost option. Compound that by the fact that most physicians are not super up to date with the guidelines. I mean, they might go to CME conferences and attend ASCO every year, but it's just hard to keep up, even if you're kind of reading as like a full-time job. So having a standardized system where you are implementing protocols that are point of care, as well as a second level review, is not something that's standard. I mean, we do it at the Oncology Institute at scale. And that's part of why we get kind of great results in terms of being able to manage costs and deliver clinically effective care. But that's not the reality, unfortunately, for most practices in the country.
So value-based care oncology, you mentioned results. What are the results? So all these different components add up to X dollars in savings, Y percentage of savings. What are the key result outcomes that you look to measure the success of your business?
Yeah, absolutely. And we stand behind our clinical model through published results. We actually just presented at ASCO last week, kind of the latest iteration of our data. But when you put this all together, again, making the right therapeutic decisions for patients, delivering it in the community, providing highly coordinated care, and helping them navigate the very complex cancer journey, the results are lower total cost of care. We measure that typically over 30% versus benchmark. Much lower Part A utilization, which we haven't really talked about yet, but through ER avoidance and hospitalization, through better coordination of care and keeping people on protocol for whatever therapy they're getting, lower Part A utilization, so reducing total cost of care. Higher patient satisfaction. So again, creating this type of journey for a patient engages them more in the process and results in better outcomes because they have a better understanding of their care and better outcomes for patients. So we measure clinical outcomes as well, and have shown time and time again that kind of making these decisions again results in great outcomes for patients.
When you think about the Oncology Institute relative to some of your peers, because there are several other large national oncology players in the market, are they doing similar things to you? Or are there things that stand out that are uniquely differentiated for the Oncology Institute?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's basically three different flavors of kind of what you see out there right now in terms of solutions, so to speak, for a health plan or medical group when it comes to kind of managing their oncology network and spend. There's what I would refer to as like the legacy solution, which I come from a primary care risk background prior to joining TOI and sort of used some of these platforms in the past, but those are what we would call benefit managers, which are basically companies that sit in between a payer and a network of 100% independent oncologists and are providing and are delegated for prior authorization, utilization management, and they've kind of got pathways and protocols, and those are value-based decisions. But the issue there is, again, they don't really own any component of the physician experience. So they're naturally at odds with practices in the network, which might be, again, making kind of more fee-for-service based decisions. That's what existed from early 2000s through maybe 5 years ago or so, sort of, I would say moderate effectiveness, low PMPM for the risk-bearing group or the health plan to engage with these entities. The kind of other end of the spectrum would be the newer kind of care management platforms. So think like a Time Care, and there's a number of other kind of platforms starting up in this realm. Very similar to what's you've seen in the CKD space in the last 5 or 6 years with like a Monogram or Panoramic, where they're really focusing on kind of care navigation and contracting against total cost of care reduction and savings. I would say from a payer perspective, they're very frictionless, meaning they're kind of doing things that your network oncologists aren't really doing. They're not really having treatment-based decisions as much with the oncologists. So they're easy to overlay. And, again, newer, so somewhat untested in terms of the total value they'll provide. I think we started to see some of the results in the CKD space. I think you've seen some examples of moderate cost of care improvement, but very difficult to control in a big way spend if you're not touching the Part B and D components in a rigorous way. And then there's us. We're, again, an employed physician group. We have a WRAP MSO network of independents in markets where health plans may not delegate network and claims down to the risk-bearing medical groups. And what that does is it just gives a much higher degree of control over the care delivery process and consistency in care delivery. Since our physicians are employed by us, they're aligned to our model. They're practicing here because they philosophically agree with how we practice. And that means we can contract at a much more aggressive rate with our payer partners. So it's helped us grow tremendously. And then just a much greater degree of confidence in terms of our ability to manage that risk once we have control.
So it sounds like, and it's not surprising, but it sounds like there have been different point solutions or different solutions that have addressed different layers, from network management to care coordination to clinical services. And the Oncology Institute's approach is to have those three layers at least integrated under one umbrella, and that gets differentiated outcomes. Is that a fair summary?
That's absolutely correct.
So on the network side, then does that mean that and I think this is what you were saying a second ago, but does that mean you have two sides to your business? You have the employed physicians and then also a network of affiliate physicians?
Yeah, absolutely. In markets where health plans delegate financial risk down to risk-bearing primary care groups, but they don't delegate network and claims, those primary care groups, they've got a great need for TOI services, but they don't really have the ability to capitate us or contract directly with us. We have to engage with a third party, which is the health plan. And health plans see tremendous value in our services as well. In order to do that, we need to be able to take those functions, network, claims, contracting from the health plan, manage those ourselves, and then we can capitate on behalf of the lives that are delegated down to the risk-bearing group. So the way that we do that is we've got a TPA structure integrated into TOI now, which allows us to contract, pay claims, manage a network of independents. We still have our employed locations in a market. That's really important because that adds to the consistency of care we deliver. And then we create a network of highly engaged independents that wrap around us on both medical and radiation oncology. So from a member perspective, there's still tremendous options within the market and the network for them to receive care. It allows us to grow more efficiently, and it allows us to take on those functions that the health plan is not delegating down to the risk-bearing group.
So there's a lot there. I just want to unpack it to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So it sounds like a three-party relationship. It sounds like the ultimate global risk holder remains, in this case, the primary care group. And then it sounds like for the subcontracted portion of oncology, you're working underneath that global risk, but directly with the payer to come to terms on a bundle or sort of carve out for oncology services.
That's right. Yes.
And it sounds like you've had to, in order to do that, build out fairly robust infrastructure around actuarial and claims processing infrastructure to manage that subcontracted risk for oncology services.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And you might ask the question, what's the health plan's motivation to engage in this process? Because they've already passed the financial risk down to the risk-bearing medical group, and they're, kind of hoping that they do a good job kind of managing that spend. And it really comes down to two things. One is primary care physician satisfaction. You've got unmanaged, uncontrolled oncology spend. Their most important primary care physician groups that hold all the membership become very unsatisfied, and that can create problems for the plan partner. And then two is quality of care. And again, I think this gets back to I think why we've been successful and been around for 18 years. At the end of the day, It's one thing to kind of, do value-based arrangements and take financial risk, but then you actually have to manage the care appropriately, ensure that members are having grievances to the health plan, that you're delivering great clinical outcomes. And again, that's unfortunately an issue in community-based oncology in the U.S. is just highly inconsistent care. And that's where we kind of come in and I think create a better environment for patients.
And who's making the decision about creating that oncology network? Is that made by the primary care risk bearing group, or is the payer going to the primary care group and saying, this is your oncology solution?
Yeah, it's really the fundamental decision is made between TOI and the health plan partner. I mean, there are situations where health plans like we need whatever hospital or integrated health system in the network. So we will incorporate them. But we do, and we've got a fantastic actuarial team. We do a rigorous analysis of kind of what's going on in the community outside of TOI with spend and kind of put forth a recommended network, which might include exclusion of high cost centers that might not necessarily be necessary for network adequacy to help drive value through network.
I'd be curious what the experience has been and what the strategy has been for building this network. So, we always think about sort of the employed or owned portion of the network being able to be standardized. You mandate, here's your system, here's your clinical pathways, here's your operations team, your clinical team to sort of set guidelines and manage workflows across the network and create high levels of standardization over time. And then you have the affiliate portion where there's a lot less control and a lot less that you can mandate and standardize. How do you get the same outcomes and the same clinical pathways from a quality, from a cost perspective on the affiliate side? What's that process?
Yeah. That's a great question. There's a couple different strategies that we utilize there. So one is how you incentivize appropriate value-based decisions in contracting. So you can do things like put in preferential rates for biosimilar utilization would be like one simple example, but there's a number of others. So you can kind of drive economic incentives for the independent practices to make value-based decision, on therapeutics, but overall lower, again, total spend on therapeutics in doing so. They're really getting kept whole, but you're using an overall less expensive drug. That's one important strategy. Two, that we do have practices in the network that just brown bag, which means they're not buying and billing the drugs. In those situations, they're not super tied into the drug selection and generally have an easier time adhering kind of with value-based protocols if it might be a less expensive but equally clinically efficacious drug. And then three, because we are an employed practice and we have our own retail pharmacy and dispensary, we've got economies of scale on drug procurement, so we can procure at a much lower cost than an outside specialty pharmacy, which prior to us kind of taking over a network tends to be the legacy sort of supplier to practices or to a health plan. If there's an aligned specialty pharmacy, they generally fill at much higher cost. So that's another way to look at it.
Out of your provider roster or network, what percentage is employed versus affiliate today? And what do you expect over time? Do you expect that ratio to change?
Yeah, it varies by market. So for example, in California, the prevailing sort of strategy for health plans is to delegate everything down to risk-bearing medical groups. The medical groups almost function like health plans themselves. There, they all have Knox-Keene licenses, so we are almost 100% employed in California because they can just capitate TOI as a sole oncology provider. In markets like Florida, pretty much anywhere like east of Nevada, the model is much more employed with wrap MSO network. Just like in the primary care world, the network model grows much faster than the employed model. So I'd anticipate over time that ratio will continue to shift. For example, in Florida, we've got currently about 15 employed centers, and we've got over 37 wrap practices just in the 5 counties where we currently exist. I would suspect there'll be over 100 MSO practices within a year as we kind of grow.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things that are interesting. So one, we are seeing a growing number of specialty MSOs that are moving beyond being employers of providers and acquirers of provider groups. And so thinking as really managing companies within their clinical domains and building networks. And so they're getting involved at the contract level, building out a network and delivering outcomes and being rewarded for that. And so I think it's been interesting to watch these provider organizations grow in scale, grow in sophistication, and then transcend to take on a different role of building networks within their care clinical specialties. That's been exciting to see. The but, and I don't know if but's the right word, is it seems to sort of bring us back to the beginning of the conversation when we talked about sort of intersecting at different layers. I can build a network, I can be a sort of a point solution, care coordination, or I can be a provider of clinical services, and TOI was going to be all three. You'll continue to be all three, but it sounds like as the model goes more towards building a network that you start to sort of be weighted towards that network level. Do you think that maintaining a clinic presence, even if it's a smaller portion, makes you a much better network over time, or is this just a better network strategy than what was built in the earlier evolutions?
Yeah, I anticipate we'll always be hybrid, meaning employed and wrap MSO network, simply because our kind of secret sauce, comes in that model. And just the greater degree of, again, clinical consistency we get in our employed centers. And that's really just taking a page out of the playbook that you've seen in the highly successful primary care risk world. I mean, obviously, there's like network only models. They tend to grow fast, and that's great. But the level of control is just different than models where you've got an employed presence. Obviously, we can't be 100% employed. That just grows too slow. It's very capex intensive. And would allow us to kind of scale effectively. But I don't ever see us being in a market where it would just be like 100% network physicians and no TOI locations.
Yeah. And I do look, even in a non-clinical capacity, our revenue cycle service, our consulting services are improved by being in the revenue cycle business. I think having that sort of connective tissue to the actual delivery of care on a day-to-day basis keeps you very connected with the practical and gives you an edge. And I think the businesses that move away from that start to lose some of the relevancy to the day-to-day realities. So I can see that synergy there. I noticed Florida Oncology Network was recently announced, and would love to hear a little bit more about what that is. And maybe that's a good segue to the reimbursement side of the equation and talking about how TOI benefits financially, how you're reimbursed for what you built within this value-based care environment.
Yeah. Yeah, Florida Oncology Network is simply, and this will exist in any market where we have an MSO, just the legal entity that houses our MSO in sort of employed practices. And that allows us to work with, again, a TPA structure to get delegated with risk appropriately with health plan partners. So that will be sort of the prevailing name of all of our employed and network practices in the Florida market. And again, that'll be something that we duplicate in other markets as we grow. Our contracting model going back to 2007, and we still firmly believe this, has always been to take population level capitated risk on oncology spend. We believe that's the right alignment of incentives to deliver great care to patients and be able to account for the really expensive cases that come up. The difficulty sort of contracting on sort of an episodic basis in cancer care is that the percentage of patients in a population that need an oncologist in a given year is relatively small. In a senior population, it's typically 9 to 11%, roughly half to a quarter that in commercial and managed Medicaid populations. So, just aggregating risk pools over at a population level allows us to appropriately buffer against really expensive cases. And then we're primarily taking risk on Part B, which is where the largest chunk of spend is going to be in a cancer patient's journey. That being said, we have our high value cancer care program, which is our sort of care navigation platform. Again, we've had it for many years. We've published on it, including last week in ASCO. And we do get Part A incentives related to reduction in ER visits and hospitalizations with several of our key partners.
Partners is a good segue. I was going to ask about strategic partnerships. You mentioned working with the payers and sort of an indirect partnership with the risk-bearing primary care groups as part of that. What other partnerships have helped grow TOI? Are you working with employers? Are you partnering with hospitals in any form? What are the strategic partnerships you look to help grow and differentiate TOI?
Yeah. Right now, we've got over 2 million lives that we take risk on across products, Medicare, commercial, and managed Medicaid. And that's with almost every big health plan and scaled risk-bearing medical group in the country. Many of those relationships go back well over 10 years. And in fact, we still, two of our anchor capitation agreements from 2007, we still have. And I think that's a testament, again, to the high level of quality of care we provide. If we were a new startup with this kind of like new idea on taking risk and it was untested, that'd be one thing. But I think that we've proven over the last 18 years that we can retain our partnerships, which means high quality of care to patients. And then most of our new growth happens by way of reference from an existing partner to one of their sister groups or another related health plan in a new market. So we do, get inbounds from new payers all the time. But for example, what brought us into Florida was just a medical group that was under the umbrella of other medical groups that we already took risk with in California. Again, I think a testament to the quality of care we provide.
What is your level of interaction or nature of your interaction with hospital systems?
Yeah, so we generally interact in a pretty symbiotic way, I would say, with hospital systems. There's a few types of clinical situations that can't be taken care of in the community in oncology. So stem cell transplant's a big one, and that's not like a physician competency issue. It's just that community hospitals, for the most part, aren't really like set up to handle a stem cell transplant. So those have to go to an academic or tertiary center. Very, very complex surgical cases. Most cancer surgery in the U.S. is actually delivered by general surgeons because you don't have a huge quantity of like board certified surgical oncologists. But there are very complex cases that need to go to an academic or tertiary center. In general, unfortunately, many of those centers are not very friendly to managed care populations or Medicaid populations. So they're happy. They do have typically arrangements in place for things like stem cell transplant. They're happy to manage those patients for that episode, which is very small in terms of the total percentage of care we deliver, and then kind of repatriate them to us for aftercare once their procedure or transplant is done. Beyond that, we're on staff at, I think now over 90 hospitals across the country. We do, thousands of inpatient encounters a year at a community hospital level, and so our relationship there is very, very positive. I would say, I've been a hospitalist myself for the last 20 years. It's not very common to see medical oncologists come into the hospital, especially on the weekends. And I think that's a place where we excel because, again, our partners are taking global risk generally. And it's important for us to show up and have that continuity with patients when they're hospitalized.
So are you working with hospitals in the way that you're working with risk-bearing primary care groups, where the payer is coming to the Oncology Institute as the oncology dedicated solution, but the global contract holder is the hospital in this case?
Yeah, we've had a lot of interest from hospital systems in partnering with them. Again, if you think about how hospitals reimburse, they're not super interested in like having catastrophic long length of stay cases, right? And so that kind of aligns to our care model in terms of being efficient, trying to keep things in the community. To be honest, we've had so much growth on sort of the health plan risk bearing group side. We haven't really put our heads down to pursue that fulsomely at this point, but there's a lot of opportunity there. So I think that's something we'd be open to in the future.
As you've had all this growth and there's a lot of building that I've heard here. You have to build the networks, you have to build the infrastructure for the claims processing and the actuarial services. I imagine there's a tension or a trade-off between growth, profitability, and investment. And so I'm just wondering how you balance that. And I think the other unique aspect is TOI is a public company. So you've had to balance that in the midst of being a public company. Talk about that dynamic. How has that felt? And is there a unique aspect to that given that you're a public company?
Yeah, absolutely. About over 4 years ago now, we made the decision as a leadership team with our board, who's very supportive, to go public. We felt there's just massive untapped demand given the TAM of spend in oncology for our services, and long term, there was no issue with us being able to grow, but we needed really the capital to support that. So we went public. We partnered with Deerfield through a reverse merger that happened in 2021. That obviously put capital on our balance sheet, which allowed us to expand in states like Florida and put a footprint down. Having been here now for 6 years, I'll tell you the early years of being a small but rapidly growing public company are very challenging, and we've survived and shown that we can survive. And we're now really hitting our stride in terms of scaling to a point where we have no issues being able to continue to grow and exist as a public company. We just restructured our balance sheet about 3 months ago. We're in a good spot at this point as far as cash needed to grow to plan, and we're anticipating, as we've talked about in our earnings calls, our flip to profitability happening in Q4 of this year. It's been a journey for sure, but I'm glad we made the decision at this point, and we're at a scale now where we can continue to survive as a public company.
I'm sure that'll be a welcome milestone. So we wish you luck on that pathway to profitability later this year. We haven't talked a lot about technology, and I'm wondering when it comes to managing drug spend, when it comes to standardizing clinical pathways, if technology has played a role, and if so, how TOI has approached technology, third-party solutions, building internally. What's been the approach to technology?
Yeah, so the first place I would go would not be drugs, but sort of, again, if you think about being a provider who's always seeking to deliver value to patients and payers and lower total cost of care, there's a tremendous amount of cost in kind of the central business office and RCM component of oncology. So, obviously we're taking care of hundreds of thousands of patients in the clinic each year. Every one of those patients needs a prior authorization. Every one of them has billing and collection issues. Every one of them is calling our clinics typically multiple times. We also get calls from payer partners and other people that we interact with. All that is work that is handled by our central business office. We've, over the past 3 years, done a pretty good job of trying to be early adopters of technology to drive efficiencies in a lot of those functions. And like every other company now, we're just starting to scratch the surface of AI utilization. We have sort of 3 near-term use cases, which we're really excited about when it comes to integrating generative AI to drive further efficiencies in our business. The big ones are obviously, again, prior authorization, which is just a very protocolized, manual kind of labor intensive process, which can be fully automated and tracked. And that's good for patients because when things go wrong with prior authorization, at the other end of that is a patient that might have a delay in care. We want to minimize that, avoid that whenever possible. The other big one is kind of call center utilization. We handle over 500,000 calls a month at TOI, and that's just, again, tremendous amount of volume. Generates a lot of frustration for patients when their calls aren't handled efficiently. And a lot of the reasons that people are calling in are fairly straightforward and can be resolved, whether that's an appointment, scheduling time or scheduling an appointment, or a question about clinic hours, things like that. So that's another great use for generative AI technology, which we're exploring and hoping to engage near term. And then the last one is on RCM, kind of denials management, prior auth management, and sort of collections. And there's a number of great platforms out there already, which we've been engaged with, which we think are going to drive tremendous efficiencies. So when you look at our sort of P&L, we've got 90 million in OpEx. So just tremendous opportunity for us to get more efficient and deliver better care by integrating technology in those fronts. On the drug side of the house, there is a role, I think, for automation, and we do look at that very carefully. However, that being said, again, our sort of secret sauce is our incredible clinical leadership on the clinical decision-making side. We've got a great team of medical directors, which are constantly looking at our protocols, integrating new therapies when they're approved by the FDA, providing verbal one-on-one peer-to-peers with our employed physicians as well as our network providers. And we just hired Jeff Langsam out of Cigna to be our chief clinical officer. They are looking heavily at ways that we can just automate kind of simple decisions. And that's really where technology comes in and will drive a lot of efficiencies over time.
We've seen, just combining experiences across different specialties, we've seen some interesting strategies. There was a group that has expanded internationally and another that's considering doing that. There was a group that has expanded from the non-hospital market to now provide managed services for the hospital market. There are a number of groups that have built networks like what you're saying, clinically integrated organizations. There are groups that have expanded from single specialty focus to making early inroads in a second specialty that was adjacent. When you think 5 years from now, what it takes to be a leader in the oncology market, you've mentioned a number of things about efficiency gains, about being more heavily weighted on a network. One, what is it that you're most excited about? And two, is there anything sort of transformative in the market that you think you will have to do between now and 5 years in order to remain a leader in the oncology network nationally?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the first place I would go in terms of unaddressed needs beyond just like health plans and risk-bearing groups that we already work with would be kind of the employer and self-insured space. We already have a few existing partnerships across our markets on behalf of employer group populations, but there's just tremendous untapped need there. And I think our model is perfectly suited to deliver great care to those populations. So I think that's one area that we really have just started to scratch the surface on, which I think could be a huge lever of growth for us. The other big one is really MSO enablement. And by that, I mean, right now we engage with networks of independent physicians on sort of value-based decision-making and leveraging our ability to deliver care at scale. Oncology care is perfectly set up, though, to engage with them on ancillary service opportunities that brings value both to TOI and those practices. The big ones are drug. So being a specialty pharmacy that can fill drugs faster and cheaper for patients on the Part D side of the house is tremendously valuable to those practices, and of course TOI as well, as that drives our Part D business. And the other big one is clinical trials. We've had a longstanding community-based clinical trials program, I think one of the largest in the country, and the ability to decentralize that to independent practices, so you can appropriately and compliantly compensate them to engage in clinical trials through things like chart abstraction. Those protocols still get delivered in our clinics. That avoids that practice losing that patient to an academic or tertiary center, and engages them in a way that typically they don't on a day-to-day basis. Again, tremendously valuable for us because it grows our trials program, but then creates greater stickiness with our MSO practice partners. Those are like the two big ones off the cuff that I think will be transformative over the next kind of like 24 to 36 months.
And do you see TOI still being focused on 5 markets in 24 to 36 months, or do you see expansion beyond?
Yeah, we kind of have internal criteria that will allow us to open a new market. If we get a big enough opportunity in a new market, we will definitely entertain it. And we can open markets fairly quickly and efficiently. It generally takes about 120 days from the time we sign a contract to when we deliver care. That being said, like Florida, for example, we're in 5 counties now. We entered that market just over 4 years ago. And that market itself could be as big or bigger than California, where we've been for 18 years. So there's a vast untapped landscape just in Florida that could, grow TOI to 2.5x its size. Same thing with Nevada. We've been in that market 6 years. We are really starting to execute on growth there. And we're just in Clark County, which is Las Vegas. There's Reno, which has a ton of need as well. So we're still executing on growth in our existing markets. We will look at new markets, but our growth model is not like put as many dots on the map as possible, like an urgent care business. We're really much more focused on kind of growing where there's opportunity, and it has to be big enough to make sense for us.
Makes sense. Well, I really want to thank you for your time. I mean, it's been incredibly insightful and informative to get a glimpse about what you have been building at TOI, and kudos to you for the leadership you've demonstrated and how much you've traveled over the past 6 years since you have been at the helm of the company. So congratulations, and wish you lots of luck on achieving the milestones that you've laid out in this conversation.
Thanks so much, Jason. Really appreciate the opportunity to be on the podcast today, and best of luck.